I'm a 38-year-old mother of 3, 14, 12, and 9. And if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that family bonds mean nothing when only one side is doing the work. My father, Richard 62M, was never a great dad, but lately, he's been determined to play the role of a loving grandfather at least when there's an audience. Growing up, my relationship with Richard was distant at best. He wasn't outright cruel, but he was the kind of father who made it clear that his comfort mattered more than anything else. He worked long hours, but even when he was home, he was emotionally checked out. If I needed help with homework, he was too tired. If I wanted to talk about my day, he'd nod absently while watching TV. My mother held our home together, making up for what he lacked. Then, when I was 16, she passed away. Richard barely waited before moving on. Within a year, he had remarried a woman named Diane 58F, who had 2 kids from a previous marriage. And just like that, my family was no longer mine. Diane was loud, opinionated, and obsessed with image. She treated me more like an inconvenience than a stepdaughter, and Richard didn't just let it happen, he encouraged it. Diane's children became his priority, and I was pushed to the background. I moved out as soon as I turned 18. No fights, no dramatic last words, I was just done. I went low contact, got a job, built my life, and eventually met my husband, Mark 40M. We built something solid together, had our 3 kids, and honestly, I didn't think much about Richard. He made his choices, and I had my own family now. Then, a few years ago, he started trying to reconnect. At first, I thought it was guilt finally catching up to him, but I quickly realized it was about appearances. His friends were becoming grandparents, posting about family trips and bonding moments, and suddenly, Richard wanted in on that image, but not in the way that actually mattered. He didn't want to know their interests, help them with school, or be a presence in their lives. He wanted them for the photo ops. He'd make big promises about taking them places, then cancel last minute. He forgot birthdays. If he did show up, it was all surface-level interaction, nothing genuine. My kids noticed, but Richard expected respect and admiration from them, just for existing. The final straw came when he invited them for a weekend getaway. My kids already had commitments, a school play, a soccer game, but when I told him, he exploded. He called me selfish for not making them available to him. Then came the real accusation. He said I was turning them against him. He claimed I was making them cold, ungrateful. Diane and her children, who barely even knew my kids, jumped in, calling me dramatic and accusing me of playing the victim. That's when I realized I was done. If Richard wanted to know why the kids didn't prioritize him, he could hear it straight from them. It just so happened that Diane was planning her annual family appreciation dinners, a tradition she loved, where she got to play the perfect hostess and celebrate family bonds. We were rarely invited, but this year I caught wind of the dinner from a cousin and decided to ask Diane directly if we could attend. She hesitated but, likely not wanting to appear rude in front of others, extended the invitation. Richard was thrilled. He wanted to show off his grandkids to his friends. He had no idea what was coming. Before the dinner, I sat my kids down. I told them there was no pressure, but if their grandfather asked why they weren't close, they could tell him the truth. No need to be mean, no need to argue, just be honest. They agreed. I wasn't going to make my father look bad. He was going to do that all by himself. Walking into Diane's house for the family appreciation dinner felt like stepping onto a stage where the script had already been written, except I wasn't playing the role they wanted. The dining room was perfectly set, the lighting just right for Diane's inevitable photo op, and the table was packed with extended family, old friends of Richard's, and of course, Diane's 2 adult children, who were treated like royalty. Richard sat at the head of the table, looking smug, already basking in the attention of the guests. Diane, on the other hand, looked less than thrilled to see me and my kids. Her tight smile barely masked her irritation as we walked in. My step-siblings barely glanced up, more interested in their own conversations. It was immediately clear that we weren't expected to actually be part of this family appreciation event. We were props, nothing more. The moment we sat down, Richard made a show of introducing my kids to his friends, speaking loudly enough that the entire table could hear. He talked about how much they'd grown and how he was so proud of them, like he had played any role in their lives. He even threw in some exaggerated stories about their accomplishments, things he hadn't even been there for. Diane wasted no time slipping in her usual comments. "It's so good to finally see you make time for family," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. It wasn't a compliment, it was a passive-aggressive reminder that in her eyes I was the one keeping my kids away. Richard took the opportunity to launch into a speech about the importance of family bonds. He spoke about how families needed to stay connected, how too many people nowadays forgot where they came from, and how true love and respect meant prioritizing family above all else. It was obvious who the speech was aimed at. His tone was full of the usual guilt-tripping, as if I had been the one refusing to be involved, not the other way around. Then he turned his attention to my kids, asking them pointed questions designed to lead them into agreeing with him. He asked how much they enjoyed visiting him, what their favorite thing about Grandpa was, how excited they were to spend more time together. It was my 14-year-old son who spoke first. "We don't visit because you don't make an effort," he said, matter-of-factly. "You cancel plans and don't even know what sports we play." The table went silent. Richard blinked a few times, like he hadn't expected a real answer. He laughed awkwardly and tried to brush it off, but my 12-year-old daughter followed up. "You forgot my birthday 3 years in a row. You only text when you want a picture for Facebook." Diane stiffened. Richard's expression darkened, but he still tried to play it off. Oh, come on now. That's not true. But my kids weren't done. My 9-year-old, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Mom doesn't talk bad about you, he mumbled, picking at his napkin. But we kinda just see it ourselves. That was the moment everything shifted. The forced smiles around the table vanished. The conversation died completely. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Diane, who had been waiting for me to step in, turned her glare directly at me, as if this was all part of some scheme I had orchestrated. Richard's face turned red, but instead of taking in what had just been said, he went on the defensive. He turned his attention to me, accusing me of raising them to be ungrateful. I stayed calm. I don't tell them anything, I said. They're just telling you how they feel. Diane, realizing this was turning into a disaster, jumped in to smooth things over. Well, maybe we all need to work harder at staying connected, she said, forcing a smile. My kids just shrugged. They weren't angry. They weren't emotional. They were simply telling the truth. Richard sulked for the rest of the meal. He barely spoke, avoiding eye contact with the kids. The rest of the guests awkwardly changed the subject, pretending like nothing had happened, but the tension never really left the room. The perfect family dinner had crumbled, and there was no way to undo it. When it was time to leave, Richard didn't even say goodbye. The morning after the dinner, my phone buzzed nonstop. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. Diane was the first to strike. A long, angry text filled my screen, paragraphs upon paragraphs about how I had allowed my kids to humiliate Richard in front of his friends. She went on about how disrespectful they had been, how I was clearly raising them with no sense of family, and how she and Richard had opened their home only to be met with rudeness. The usual guilt-tripping, except now she was furious because the illusion of a perfect family had shattered in front of an audience. Not even 10 minutes later, Richard followed up with his own text. His was shorter but just as bitter. He accused me of setting him up, of embarrassing him on purpose. According to him, I had fed my kids lies, twisted their perception of him, and used the dinner as a way to make him look bad. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I sent one response. You wanted to know why they don't visit. You got your answer. That should have been the end of it. But of course it wasn't. By noon, extended family was involved. My aunt texted, saying Richard was devastated, claiming I had ruined the dinner and hurt him deeply. My uncle chimed in with something vague about how family doesn't air grievances at the dinner table. A cousin I barely spoke to asked why I couldn't have handled things privately. Handled what? Exactly. My kids told the truth. That was it. Mark, my husband, read the messages over my shoulder and scoffed. You did nothing wrong, he said, shaking his head. They just don't like that they can't control the narrative anymore. Richard must have realized his angry texts weren't getting the response he wanted because later that afternoon, he called. I let it go to voicemail, but he tried again. The third time I picked up. His tone was completely different from the morning. He was calmer, almost careful with his words. He said he just wished I had given him a heads up before the kids confronted him. I reminded him that they weren't fed lines. They spoke from their own experiences. He sighed, then shifted tactics. He said he wanted to fix things. He didn't want to be cut off from his grandkids. He just needed another chance. I told him the truth. He'd had 14 years to be a real grandparent. The kids didn't owe him anything. Relationships weren't built on last-minute grand gestures or social media performances. They were built through showing up. He didn't like that answer. He demanded to know what I expected him to do. I told him, if you want a relationship, you have to show up, not just when it's convenient. There was a long pause. Then, without acknowledging anything I had said, he muttered, I just don't understand why you're being so difficult about this. I hung up. That evening, Diane sent another text, just as passive-aggressive as the first. She claimed I was breaking the family apart and that I needed to apologize. I screenshotted it, sent it back with one response. No, this is on him. Richard was still sulking online. He hadn't posted anything outright attacking me, but his Facebook was suddenly filled with vague posts about how sad it is when children turn on their parents and how some people forget who raised them. Diane, of course, commented under every post with things like heartbreaking and some people just don't appreciate what they have. It was predictable. My 14-year-old scrolled through the posts that night and shook his head. He just doesn't get it. My younger kids weren't surprised either. If anything, they just seemed relieved. They didn't have to keep pretending anymore. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying the weight of making my father feel better at my or my kids' expense, and I wasn't about to start again. A few days after the dinner, just when I thought the dust had settled, a long-winded email from Richard landed in my inbox. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. The first few paragraphs were all about how he had never realized his grandkids felt this way. He acted like the dinner was the first time he had ever heard of any issues, conveniently forgetting all the canceled plans, the forgotten birthdays, and the years of him treating them like an afterthought. He accused me of deliberately keeping them distant and turning them against him. According to him, I had poisoned their minds and twisted reality. Nowhere in the email did he take responsibility. Nowhere did he acknowledge that his absence had consequences. It was just excuse after excuse, shifting blame while painting himself as the victim. I barely finished reading before my phone buzzed. Diane, of course. Another text, this time accusing me of poisoning the well and making Richard look bad in front of everyone. She claimed that I had set him up at the dinner and that I had always had some kind of vendetta against him. I showed Mark both the email and the text. He read them over once, then laughed. They really think you orchestrated this? Apparently, Richard and Diane believed I had spent years crafting some grand scheme to embarrass them, rather than considering the simple truth that their own actions had led to this moment. Then, extended family started weighing in. An aunt texted, saying Richard was deeply hurt and that I should at least try to make amends for the sake of keeping the family together. Another relative suggested I should put the past behind me and be the bigger person. A cousin I rarely spoke to chimed in, saying, "Your dad just wants a second chance." One of my other cousins, however, the one who had always been at odds with Richard, called me directly. "He pulled this exact same thing with my mom years ago," she said. "She called him out for how he treated her growing up, and he played dumb, acted like she was imagining it. Then he got the whole family to guilt trip her. Same script, different year. It was just confirmation of what I already knew. This wasn't about fixing things. This was about control." Then Richard called. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. I answered. He didn't acknowledge the email. He didn't ask how the kids were doing. He jumped straight into how he just didn't understand why I was doing this to him. He kept circling back to the idea that I was turning his grandkids against him. I kept my response simple. I didn't. They told you how they feel, and instead of listening, you're making this about yourself. He went quiet for a second, then switched tactics. He brought up my mother. She would be heartbroken to see the family like this, he said. That was the moment I saw red. My mother was the only real parent I ever had. She was the one who raised me, cared for me, and showed me what love was. Richard had moved on from her, like she was just an old chapter in his life. Now he wanted to use her as leverage? Mom would be heartbroken, I said, but not because of me. Because you didn't care enough to step up. Silence. Then, instead of reflecting on what I said, he dismissed it. He accused me of being too emotional, of hanging on to the past, of being unwilling to move forward. That was it. I was done. This conversation is over until you're ready to take responsibility, I said. Then I blocked him, blocked Diane, blocked the flying monkeys, stirring the pot. No more excuses, no more guilt, no more playing into his version of reality. After blocking Richard and Diane, I figured things would quiet down. I focused on my kids, work, and actually enjoying the peace that came with cutting out the drama. But of course, that didn't last long. A week later, my aunt, Richard's sister, reached out. She invited me and the kids over for a small family gathering. She framed it as something casual, just a chance to reconnect. Something felt off. This aunt had never gone out of her way to invite us to anything before, but I decided to go. Maybe she just wanted to catch up. Maybe she saw through Richard's nonsense and wanted to show support. Or maybe, as soon as I walked in, I'd realize I had walked straight into a trap. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew. Richard was there. Diane was there. A handful of other relatives were seated in a semicircle, like they were waiting for some grand speech. It wasn't a gathering, it was a setup. Diane wasted no time getting started. She put on her best concerned voice and launched into something about how the family needed to move forward and repair relationships. She talked about how important it was to keep family bonds strong and how things have gotten out of hand. Richard, playing the wounded grandfather, shook his head and sighed. "I just want to see my grandkids. You're keeping them from me." I barely had time to respond before my 14-year-old son, who had clearly had enough, spoke up. "No, Grandpa. You don't make time for us." The air in the room shifted immediately. Richard tried to brush it off, acting confused, but my 12-year-old daughter followed up. "Why do we have to be the ones to fix things when you don't even try?" Silence. Richard looked around, as if expecting someone to step in and back him up, but no one did. Diane, realizing the plan was falling apart, jumped in, trying to shift the blame. "Your mom has made you think this way." That's when my 9-year-old, who had been quietly observing the whole thing, dropped the final blow. "Mom didn't make us think anything. We just see what you do." It was like a switch flipped. Richard's face turned red, his posture stiffened. For a brief second, it looked like he might actually admit fault. That maybe, just maybe, he'd finally get it. But then he doubled down. "You're being disrespectful," he snapped. In my day, kids didn't talk back like this, and that was all I needed to hear. I stood up, looked directly at him, and said, "You just proved why they don't want to be around you." Then I took my kids and walked out. As we stepped outside, my 14-year-old muttered under his breath. That was embarrassing for him. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. After the disaster of the so-called family intervention, I figured Richard would finally take the hint and back off. He had heard the truth straight from my kids, had his little show ruined, and had nothing left to argue. I was wrong. A week later, a message popped up from a friend. Did you see Richard's Facebook post?" I hadn't. I had him blocked, but curiosity got the best of me. I checked through a spare account. There it was. A carefully worded post full of vague, passive-aggressive remarks about how some peoples forget who raised them and how family should always come first. It was his usual tactic, avoiding direct accusations while still painting himself as the victim. He wrote about how heartbreaking it was to be pushed away by his own flesh and blood after all he had done for them. It was classic Richard, rewriting the story to make himself the victim while conveniently leaving out every reason he was in this situation. Diane, of course, was right there in the comments, fueling the fire. "Some people just want to hold grudges forever," she wrote, playing the role of the devoted wife standing by her poor, mistreated husband. Extended family and some of Richard's old friends started chiming in. A few bought into the act, offering sympathy and talking about how family should stick together. But something else stood out. Some of the younger relatives weren't having it. A cousin, who had always seemed wary of Richard, finally spoke up. "This is funny, considering you forgot my birthday for 10 years straight." Another, who had quietly distanced himself from Richard years ago, chimed in. "You only care about family when there's an audience." Their frustration had clearly been building for a while. Another commented, "You only care about family when there's an audience. Where was this energy when you missed all our graduations?" I debated ignoring it. I wasn't about to engage in whatever pity campaign he was running. But then my 14-year-old son saw the post and asked, "Can I respond?" "I kinda want to." I told him it was up to him. He typed one simple comment. "Grandpa, you don't even know our birthdays. Maybe fix that before calling us ungrateful." That was the moment everything exploded. The comment section blew up. Some people tried to defend Richard, but more and more people started calling him out. Screenshots of his post spread in family group chats, and soon it wasn't just my kids who were pushing back, it was cousins, younger relatives, and even a few extended family members who had been on the fence. Richard tried to do damage control, replying with things like, "That's not true, I love all my grandkids." But every time he said something, someone else brought up another forgotten birthday, a broken promise, or a time he just didn't show up. And then he panicked. He deleted the entire post. But it was too late. Screenshots had already spread. Some of his own friends reached out to me privately, apologizing. "I didn't know it was like this," one wrote. Another admitted they had assumed I was just being distant, but now they realized Richard had been feeding them half-truths. Diane naturally lost it. She sent another long, angry message accusing me of humiliating Richard publicly. I sent back a single reply. "No, he humiliated himself. My kids just told the truth." And that was it. From that moment on, Richard's supporters started shrinking. Even some of his oldest friends quietly stopped engaging with him. The pity party dried up. For the first time, I wasn't the one carrying the guilt. For the first time, I felt free. After the Facebook meltdown, I assumed Richard would lay low for a while. The public sympathy he was hoping for had backfired. His old friends were distancing themselves, and most of the younger relatives had sided with my kids. It seemed like the kind of situation where he'd just let it go. But as I had learned by now, Richard never truly let anything go. A week later, my cousin sent me a message. "Hey, your dad just posted some weird thing about wanting to do better." I checked from a spare account. Sure enough, there it was, a new Facebook post, written in the same overly dramatic style as the last. This time, though, he had shifted his tone. Gone was the angry ranting about ungrateful children. Now it was all about rebuilding family bonds and starting fresh. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge anything specific. He just vaguely stated that mistakes were made and that he wanted to heal and reconnect. Diane, of course, was right there in the comments, backing him up. "We just want to be part of our grandkids' lives," she wrote, like she hadn't been stirring the pot the entire time. The reactions were mixed. Some older relatives were eating it up, responding with, "So glad to hear this. Family is everything." But others weren't so quick to buy into the act. One of my cousins replied, "An apology would be a good start." Another added, "You can't just post about healing and expect everything to be fine." Then, a few hours later, I got a text. "Let's put this behind us. I'd love to take the kids out for ice cream." It was so predictable that I almost laughed. No direct apology, no real acknowledgement of what had happened. Just an attempt to sweep it under the rug with a public post and a generic offer to do something nice with the kids. But something was off. He hadn't reached out to my kids personally. He hadn't asked them what they wanted. He hadn't even asked if they were comfortable seeing him again. He just assumed I'd jump at the chance to make everything look normal. I called my kids over and told them about the message. The 14-year-old raised an eyebrow. "That's random." The 12-year-old frowned. "I don't trust him." The 9-year-old shrugged. "Does he even know what kind of ice cream we like?" That told me everything I needed to know. I decided to test him. I replied, "Sure, but let's meet at their soccer game this weekend so you can support them first." And just like that, his entire tone shifted. He responded almost immediately. I was thinking something more one-on-one. Of course he was. I pushed again. "If you want to be involved, show up for them." No response. No showing up. Nothing. 3 days later, my 12-year-old checked Richard's Facebook and found a new post. "Some people don't want to move forward. I tried, but you can't reason with bitterness." That was it. That was the moment my kids fully saw the truth. Richard didn't actually want to make amends. He just wanted to control the narrative. A month passed with no contact. For the first time in years, there were no texts, no guilt-tripping messages, no sudden attempts at damage control. Richard had finally gone quiet. Life moved forward. The kids were thriving, and without the constant weight of family drama, everything felt lighter. Then, just when I thought it was truly over, Richard tried one last desperate move. It started with Diane. Out of nowhere, she sent a long, dramatic email. The subject line alone was enough to roll my eyes. "You've ruined Richard's last chance to be a grandfather." Inside, it was nothing but guilt-tripping. Richard was heartbroken. He was devastated. He might not have many years left, and I was robbing him of precious time with his grandchildren. She accused me of being cold, unforgiving, cruel, all the usual things she said whenever she wasn't getting her way. I considered ignoring it. I really did. But instead, I sent back one question. "Then why didn't he show up to the soccer game?" Silence. No response. And that told me everything. Then, a day later, Richard himself called. He left a voicemail. his voice full of self-pity. "You're really going to keep my grandkids from me over a few misunderstandings?" I didn't respond. I didn't even listen to the rest of it. I deleted it. A week later, I got a message from a relative. Apparently, Richard and Diane were complaining to anyone who would listen about how no one visits them anymore. The best part? Even Diane's own kids had started pulling away. I later heard from a cousin that there had been growing tension for years. She had always favored one over the others, and it had finally reached a breaking point. The golden children weren't golden anymore. Without me or my kids, and now with even Diane's stepchildren distancing themselves, Richard was left with no one. Then came the real kicker. The next family appreciation dinner, the one Diane loved so much, where she got to play the role of the perfect matriarch. Almost no one showed up. A handful of relatives came out of obligation, but the crowd was nothing like before. The illusion of their perfect family had cracked beyond repair. And then the final attempt. A few weeks later, Richard sent a birthday card to my 9-year-old. No handwritten note, no personal message, just a generic happy birthday. "Grandpa loves you." My 9-year-old opened it, stared at it for a few seconds, and then asked, "Why is Grandpa acting like we're close?" And that was when I knew. They didn't feel hurt anymore. They just didn't care. I blocked Richard permanently. No more second chances. No more guilt. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely free from my father's manipulations. And it felt incredible.